Alrighty, lenses and portraits. This video will be a fairly straightforward one compared to the rest of the lens videos that we've done in this beginner series. So far, we have done how to choose the right lenses for street photography and for landscape photography. But in this video, we are of course tackling portraiture. Now, this video is going to be divided into 5 sections. We're going to talk about the most common lens for portrait photography. We're going to be talking about common focal lengths, then lens speed, zooms versus primes, and as always, we will end with my personal recommendations for you budding portrait photographers out there. Just a quick reminder, as always, that if you want to skip all of the YouTube foraging for content and education, and you want to learn photography from end to end once and for all, then check out my Photography Fundamentals course, which I will leave a link to in the description. Alrighty, now just before we dive in, as with all of the lens videos in this series, keep in mind that there is no hard and fast rule, no right or wrong for any of this stuff. The gear that you have right now could be the best gear for you. Or, it might just work perfectly. So, don't feel compelled to rush out and buy the latest and greatest thing. While in portraiture, most photographers are going to be looking for a very specific look, which lenses can help us achieve. A lot of the time, we can get most of the way there with the gear that we already have. Specifically in portraiture, it is a collaboration between the photographer and the model, and oftentimes improving the communication and the connection that you have between yourself and the model is going to get you most of the way when it comes to creating a great image. Although that is another juicy and meaty topic for another video altogether. Now, usually at this point, we'd go into the most common lens for portrait photography, but to be honest, there's so many different kinds of portraits that you can do that I wouldn't specifically say that there is a unanimous be-all and end-all lens for portrait photography. Fashion, commercial, street portraits, contextual portraits, headshots, studio shoots. They're all so varied that I couldn't honestly pinpoint one single lens. Although we do commonly see the 35 and the 85 millimeter used quite often, but it really does vary depending on the style of portraits that you take. For me personally, I'm actually a huge fan of contextual portraits. So while I will shoot from, the waist up or maybe closer detailed portraits from time to time, oftentimes I'm actually trying to blend in the background of a place with the model to show off both the model and the location. Now, this usually means that I'm shooting just a little bit wider most of the time than, say, a street portrait or a headshot. And I was actually kind of curious myself to see what patterns I had in this domain. So I actually collated together all of the portrait images that I've taken in the last couple of years and had a look at the metadata to see what lenses I personally use the most often. And as we can see here, it's actually mostly the 24mm and the 35mm for me. In terms of zooms, we've got the 1635 and the 2470 quite a bit, and then the 85 sits at 3,300 images from there. Now, this isn't really representative of a true full-time portrait photographer, as I do portraits for fun rather than work, and I'm usually doing it while I'm traveling, but it's interesting to see nonetheless. But on that, let's dive into some common focal lengths for portraits and what they are used for. I'll include examples, of course, and then we can start to get closer to a recommendation for your next lens purchase. Now, we can start wide first and foremost, and for most people, most of the time, the widest I really see people go when considering true portraits is 24 millimeters. Now, some photographers might not see 24 millimeters as true portrait lenses, but again, you can make portraits with any lens and any focal length. However, it is at 24 millimeters where you really start to see some wideness of the face due to lens distortion if you choose to shoot up close. So the advice that I have here is to save the 24 millimeter to contextual portraits. Portraits where you are typically shooting full body, or at the very least from, the knee up, and then there's lots of interesting background elements to include in your composition. Now, all of these examples that I've been showing here all have interesting elements in the background, and oftentimes you can really start to elevate a composition by styling your model with clothes and colors that really contrast or complement the background that you're in and you're shooting in as well. Now, the same goes for 35 millimeters. The difference between 24 and 35 millimeters isn't too much when it comes to portraits. And you can start to shoot, thigh or waist up without significant lens distortion as well. For me personally, I love these two focal lengths because I can still talk to the model quite comfortably at this distance. And, you're only ever going to be an arm's length or two away. So it still feels like you are right there with them. Also, if you're shooting at f1.4 at 35 millimeters at, say, waist height and above, you can also start to get some gorgeous bokeh in the composition as well, which we will talk more about in the next section of the video. The next common focal length is 50 millimeters. Now, this is honestly as do everything as you can get, in my opinion. And if you want something more contextual of your portraits, you can step back in your scene and you won't have to go a country mile just to make your subject a little smaller. And if you want, something close and personal, it's not too close that you're right up in your model's face. At this focal length, you're also going to get next to no lens distortion as well. So you can go as close to the subject as you would like. 50 is a great middle ground. And then the last common focal length that I'll mention in this segment is the ever faithful 85 millimeter. This is one that many portrait photographers love to use because it's at this focal length that you start to get what's called compression. This is when the background of the image looks like it's closer to the subject. And it's kind of a lens distortion kind of effect that is both flattering on the face because it has a slightly narrowing effect. And it is also interesting to look at because you can't actually see that with the human eye. It's something that only a lens can provide. And the effect actually gets greater and greater the more and more telephoto you get. Now, I will also mention that if you're using a fast lens at, say, f1.4, the bokeh that you get from this combination of focal length and shallow depth of field from the f1.4, it's absolutely creamy, especially if your background is far away from your subject. Now, it's not super uncommon to see focal lengths higher or further than 85, like 105 or something like that. However, the more telephoto that you get, the more removed you become from your subject. And remember, portraiture is all about a collaboration between you and someone else. And if you have to shout at the top of your lungs to communicate to someone across the room, well, you're most likely not going to have a very fun time. Now, one thing that most, if not many, portrait photographers want in their images is a shallow depth of field. We want this because the eyes are the windows to the soul. And in a portrait, we want the viewer of the image to look at the eyes of the person in that photo. Having shallow depth of field is like blurring out the rest of the image and saying to the viewer, hey, this is the most important thing in the composition, the person's eyes. It is, after all, the first thing someone naturally looks at when looking at a portrait. Now, shallow depth of field, or bokeh, or background blur, if you want to call it that as well, is caused by a combination of having a large aperture, such as f1.4 or f1.8, plus a more telefocal length like 50 millimeters and up. And then lastly, controlling the distance between the camera and the model. The closer, the better. This, of course, is a very simplified explanation, but for you beginners, that's all you really need to remember. A fast aperture, a telephoto lens shot as close as you can. This will get you the shallowest depth of field possible. Now, you may have heard of the term fast lenses and perhaps not known what that means. Of course, you should already by now know the exposure triangle, and if you don't, then watch the video that I made that teaches you 80% of photography basics in just 10 minutes. But fast lenses refers to the fact that large apertures such as f1.4 or f1.8 allow more light to come into your exposure. Because of this, we counteract the abundance of light with a faster shutter speed so that we can equalize our exposure. This faster shutter speed is where the term fast lenses comes from. The faster the lenses, the faster our shutter speed can go, and usually it's because it lets in more light due to it being a larger aperture. Now, in portraiture, most of the time, we're aiming for something that is faster than f2.8. I've shot many a portrait close and far with f2.8, and they still look great. But from f4, you really start to substantially lose the shallowness of the depth of field and start to lose that dreamy, creamy look. So when you are facing a purchase decision, look for f2.8, f2, f1.8, f1.4, or even f1.2 if you're getting lucky. Alrighty, if you're enjoying this video so far, I would really appreciate if you would hit that like button for me so that I know it's good enough to make even more free videos just like this in the future. Alrighty, let's talk about zooms versus primes, and usually it's a toss-up between flexibility and portability. However, in portraiture, it's perhaps more weighted between flexibility and bokeh. Portraits with bokeh are just quite simply way more attractive than portraits without it. So most of the time, I see portrait photographers with a whole host of fast prime lenses so that they can have both flexibility and bokeh at the same time. However, again, you can shoot portraits with anything. And as I've shown in the video already, I've shot a lot of portraits with zoom lenses and prime lenses over the last couple of years. Everyone's use case will be different. Some people will prefer traveling light with perhaps one body and one zoom lens. Some people will take the Holy Trinity with them. Some people will fill a bag full of primes. Heck, one of the reasons why I use the 24mm so often for portraits is because I use an A7R5 a lot of the time, so I can APS-C punch into 36mm on the fly and have that flexibility. There are a ton of different use cases for everyone, but I would say that most portrait photographers lean more towards optimizing for bokeh over optimizing for anything else. All right, personal recommendation time. I would say that if you don't already own a f1.4 lens of any focal length, that would be my very first move. There's something magical about your first super fast prime lens, and it is really fun to start experimenting with bokeh. Now, as for what focal length to go with, I would actually pick up a 24-70 or a 24-105 and actually start shooting portraits with those first, even if it's at, say, f4. And then once you start to get a good feel for what those focal lengths are and what you use often, then you can get fast prime lenses for those focal lengths. Perhaps getting a fast wide and a fast mid-tele will give you some range when it comes to contextual or close-up portraits. And for me, as we saw before, I'm mostly wide at 24 or 35, or I'm at 85. Both of these for me are great focal lengths, and they're also ones that I would recommend for you also. If you can't afford the f1.4 versions, then the f1.8 versions are absolutely amazing as well, not to mention cheaper and lighter. Now, back to you. If you've got some prime lenses and you've shot some portraits before, what focal lengths do you use? Leave them in the comments below to help out your fellow beginner photographers. All right. I hope you enjoyed that video. And again, if you want to fast track your photography learning, then check out my photography fundamentals course over at patk.com/accelerate. I'll see you in the next video, but until then, get out there and make something that matters. Peace.